Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. Really good to see you, and thanks for prioritising alternative provision in your day. I did wonder when I saw that there was an AI session on not too far away from here at the same time, just checking that people are in the right room. I'm kind of used to working in a sector where not everybody is as interested as they perhaps think they might be once they hear a little bit more about it. Before I do introductions, can I just get a feel for the audience in some respects? So how many of you currently work within the specialist sector or are connected with it? Okay, that's really useful. And how many of you, this is the sort of first opportunity to sort of talk about the specialist sector for a while? Okay, that's helpful as well. Thank you. Because it's a relatively small group, what I plan to do, rather than run through the entire presentation and just take questions at the end, I plan to sort of just stop part way through and just open up to questions and discussion and then come back to what I'm saying, because I think that we might get a more interactive session that way. I'm delighted to be here and to be able to be part of today's session and to take you through a number of things that are up on the board there. Just by way of, let's just go back actually. Sorry, there's a slide. There we are. In terms of my background, so Mark Vickers, delighted, as I said, to be here. My background has predominantly been significantly been in education as a teacher, a secondary head teacher, and then I've spent some time working in a range of alternative provision settings, either supporting them or leading them. And the connection between those two roles, between sector role in AP and as a mainstream head teacher, is the fact that I got quite well known, I think, as a secondary head teacher of just immediately saying to staff when I started in the school, we're not going to exclude young people. We're just not going to do it. We have to find another way. And what I mean by that is permanently exclude, as opposed to there may be a need for some fixed term exclusions. If a young person has significant needs and we can't meet them, then that's a conversation with a local authority about, at that point, when before multi-academy trusts were in existence, about a different way of supporting those needs. But otherwise, we don't want to be excluding anybody, and we didn't permanently exclude anybody at all. Very proud of the fact that I founded and have been leading Olive Academies for the last 11 years. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The other hat that I wear that is interconnected and hopefully will be helpful for this session is that we, myself and some colleagues, set up a national network for leaders within MATs of any form of specialist setting. So there might be a full specialist MAT of either AP or SEND, or there might be what's obviously happening more and more now, a mixed MAT that's started to take on, a mainstream MAT that's starting to take on any form of specialist academy within their MAT. So we set up a network. We now have 54 CEOs as part of that network, straddling all 9 regions, and that's a really useful collective voice for the sector, but also really useful in terms of support for the department, ESFA, around policy development, but also in terms of getting a sense of the context of how things are at the moment. And I'll weave some of those insights into what I say to you today. I'm also really lucky to be representing that network and the sector and Olive Academies in a range of advisory groups with the Department for Education, have been for a number of years now, which includes supporting the development and now the implementation of the reforms in AP and SEND, initially through the steering group and latterly, as of this week, as part of the National Implementation Board. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of just some context. So what is alternative provision? I often say that if you ask 10 people in education, what does alternative provision mean to you, you probably get 6 or 7 different answers. Probably a couple of years ago, you probably would have had 9, even 10 different answers. So it's still quite a misunderstood sector in many respects, and I think there are good reasons why that might be the case. If I just explain to you what alternative provision is, effectively it's the sector full of provision that is aimed to support young people whose behaviour or other needs present barriers to them being successful in their mainstream school, separate to the special sector in many respects in terms of the alternative provision element of it. Either because people are at risk of being permanently excluded because they might be presenting a whole range of behavioural needs, or they have a range of medical needs, which means that they're not able to fully engage in the offer as is set out in mainstream schools, and they need something a little bit different, whether it's adapted within the sector itself, the setting itself, or whether it's with support from specialist colleagues. It's a really broad church. I mean, if I just to exemplify that, the AP sector can go from, and if I think about a continuum, a high-quality alternative provision academy could have up to 200 pupils in it, all the way down to a motor mechanic who works pretty much full-time improving, cars for a living, but for one afternoon a week offers a work-based programme for a young person who's on a range of programmes as part of their mainstream education provision. So that might be all that mechanic does, but he's actually or she's part of that alternative provision sector by offering that provision. So it's a really, really broad church, as I said. And hopefully that diagram just helps to exemplify some of what I've said there, because Olive Academies is, to some degree, a microcosm, I see it, of the alternative provision sector in many respects. We have a range of, we're responsible for a range of AP academies straddling across 4 different local authorities. And what we've found over the years is that the work that we do, described there as permanent exclusion provision, preventative outreach, short stay and medical support, is starting to be stretched more and more, and we're taking more and more of that continuum up because the need is there. So we're supporting mainstream schools more and more, often through upstream preventative work that can often be described as outreach work, to stop those young people from needing to be permanently excluded, to support mainstream colleagues with their challenges. And at the other end of the continuum, moving more and more into the sort of specialist area of support for young people, partly because local authorities are still struggling a little bit with specialist placements in terms of the demand and the need, and partly because some of those young people's needs have never been diagnosed effectively in the first place. And it means that if we're not careful, alternative provision can become the sort of catch-all sector for all needs of all young people, which is not what we want at all. Hopefully that diagram just exemplifies a little bit more about the work of Olive Academies. As I mentioned, we have 5 AP academies straddling 4 local authority areas in the east of England and in London. The Havering Academy is in the London region, and that's the core of our work. And our academies really vary in need and size, up to 100 pupils, but all the way down to 40 pupils. So, you know, it's a real range there as well. The other work that we do, we can't do the work in the middle without working in partnership with our local authorities. Clearly, there are commissioners. They hold the statutory responsibility for excluded pupils, and so we have to work very closely with them. They commission us and make decisions around our placements and also around our top-up funding. The circle around outreach is growing in size, as there's a growing need and a recognition that preventative work is the way forward, and that's some of the sort of thinking behind some of the proposals within the Green Paper, particularly. And that other circle there about commission work, we're being asked more and more to support either mainstream schools or MATs or groups of schools to support them with their inclusion needs. A number of MATs are setting up, you know, a whole range of different alternative provision settings in-house, and sometimes they might need some support with helping to set that up, or to carry out a range of inclusion reviews to sort of help them with their practice particularly. We can't do what we do without working in partnership. We see ourselves as part of a continuum. Alternative provision is a challenging sector to work in. We have to work creatively, and we can only do that by working in partnership with local businesses, national businesses, as I said, local authorities. We have a range of partnerships, which for us is the only way that we feel that we can get more resource in to support our young people, but more importantly, connect our provisions with the wider world. One of the issues for me has been that pupil referral units, as the term that's still used, but in my world is sort of old money now in many respects. But they are often very separate and quite isolated by definition. You might have one PRU serving a very wide geographical need, and if that wasn't part of a broader network or organisation, sometimes that can be quite difficult. So we try to go the other way and really engage with partners as much as we can. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit now about resource management challenges in alternative provision. And in some respects, and Tanya and I were just talking very briefly before we started, there's a little bit of a perfect storm developing at the moment, and I know it was partially referred to at the very beginning of the panel session this morning in many respects, but where I want to sort of just bring that to life a little bit around alternative provision is those changing needs manifest themselves in different ways. And if we think about the changing needs of young people, first of all, the pandemic has clearly exaggerated some of the challenges that were already there. We put out our survey very recently to the network just to ask a question: do you feel that schools are excluding, or are schools excluding more? 80% said that they were. Interestingly, the key question was: do you feel that schools' thresholds are changing? 80% said they felt they were, and none of them were saying that schools are becoming more tolerant. Now, that's not a criticism of schools, because I don't know a school that isn't trying to keep all their young people or is not trying to be inclusive. It's just, pretty much exemplifies some of the challenges that the system is facing in many respects. So there's increasing complexities of needs. The other question we asked was, are you full at the moment as an alternative provision setting? And again, it was just over 80% actually said that they were full and were being asked to take more pupils. And that's exactly the situation at Olive Academies at the moment. In all of our academies, actually, the numbers have grown exponentially over the last year or two. So I think that sort of hopefully shows some of the challenges. And I think what I'm doing by highlighting this is almost giving the rationale for the need for change, which is coming through those reform proposals particularly. From a funding point of view, I'm not going to stand here and say that there's enough money in the system. We all know that there isn't. That's an argument that's been talked through many times. But the challenge, and a number of you will know this in the room already, the challenge in alternative provision around funding is probably more acute than in any other sector. You'll probably know already that not quite a half, but it depends actually, sometimes over a half of the funding per pupil is negotiated locally. In fact, sometimes it can be up to 3 times as much depending on the level and the demand in terms of the local authorities. But that is a challenge because, for example, at Olive, if I use that as an example, we're negotiating constantly with 4 local authorities who are all very supportive, by the way, but they all have, high needs deficits that they're having to manage. So that high needs budget is a challenge, isn't it? Without a doubt. So we've got increasing demand and need and challenges around funding. And it is awkward having to negotiate around different local authority approaches. So that's the rationale, as you'll see from the Green Paper and the implementation plan around the need for a national approach to funding in alternative provision, which clearly has to be the way forward. And often, those funding conversations are not always connected to need. They sometimes are, but nationally not always the case, certainly. Size and capacity is a big challenge. The smaller the setting, you'll know this, the harder it is, the less economies of scale there are. Most of, not all, but a big percentage of AP settings are often split site in buildings which are not fit for purpose. There are lovely new buildings that have been built over the years, but if I use Olive as an example, we have one brand new building, or relatively new building, fantastic, one that's been refurbed and has made a real difference. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got a provision based in a building which was originally built in Victorian times as a hospital for patients with tuberculosis. So I think, again, there's a continuum there, isn't there? What happens on the inside is fantastically good, and the department have been very supportive of additional grant funding to try and improve the building as much as possible. That's not been the issue, but it's still, there are limitations because of the way that building was set up. So that can be a challenge, certainly. Another one is with the smaller sizes in terms of numbers of staff, there's less flexibility, and that can be a challenge. Obviously, there's another side to that from a MAT perspective, and we do this at Olive, and I know that a number of you in the room will do the same, which is to share resources. We tend to put our academies in clusters as much as we can in terms of thinking about how we operate with exec heads operating across the piece, and we can share some staffing there, and we can start to get some economies of scale and think about how we ensure that the curriculum offer is fully consistent across all of them. But that, even at Olive, can be a challenge, but I'm very conscious that within the sector there are a number of settings who can't do that because of geography or because they might be isolated in terms of, as I said, a single provision. Talked a little bit about facilities already. But the hardest challenge within facilities is to try and make sure that you can offer a really personalised, broad curriculum that meets the needs of these pupils when you have, obviously, limited opportunities to be creative in terms of staffing capacity. And that can be a challenge. And you'll also know that the higher percentage of the budget that's reserved for facilities compared to the mainstream sector, because of the nature of fixed costs, can be a challenge as well. So there's a whole range of factors there. I'm not looking to set out sort of a doomsday scenario, but these are just some of the challenges. Before we get into the last one, which is recruitment and retention, which is not specific purely to the alternative provision sector. It's clearly it's an education sector issue, isn't it? But for some of those settings, again, they can find that really challenging. Interestingly, from an Olive point of view, we've sort of hit on something that seems to be working, and it was more by accident than design, actually, in some respects, that we've appointed a really strong English teacher in one of our academies who very quickly, when we got talking to her about how she was feeling about working with us, we realised and wanted to find out more about why she applied to work with us. She was returning from her first period of maternity and didn't want to get back into her mainstream school. She was an English teacher because she didn't want the demand of 7 times 30 books to mark every week, every term ongoing, whilst trying to juggle the demands of a new family. Where we talk to our new staff, we talk to them about you will spend more time planning than you would in mainstream education, because these young people's needs have to be met differently, but you'll spend less time marking. It's not that you won't be giving high quality feedback to the individuals, because you will. Some of that can be done with the young person as well, and I think that's often better anyway. But there's a definite USP there, which we've now been able to recruit more really outstanding practitioners on the back of that, because we've started to use that as part of our recruitment. It's not the only approach, but it certainly has helped, without a doubt. So approaching to managing resources in this context, there's lots of things to talk about here. You can't do this without a shared vision and common aims. It's not possible. Okay, that has to be in place. So one of the ways that we do that, and we do it really well at Olive, and I know other settings will do the same, is that we need to sort of break that down, and everybody needs to understand what the purpose is of what we're trying to achieve. And you can't do that without understanding what the culture needs to be. And at Olive, we set up and took on a number of provisions that were in special measures. So you have to sort of start again with some of those provisions, most of them actually, to get to the right point. But if you do it all through your values, you've got a much better chance of it working, without a doubt. In terms of governance, policy, structure and relationships, a lot of AP settings find it hard to get the right governors. They can find it hard to engage with the right individuals. But one of the approaches that we've taken, which I know has made quite a difference, because we try to work in partnership, and we say publicly that we exist to support schools with their inclusion challenges and to help them with them. We've drawn in a number of mainstream leaders, head teachers, deputy heads, assistant heads, onto our what we call academy advisory boards, so local governing bodies, if you like, and that increases the quality around the table, but it also increases the connectivity, and it increases the accountability as well, doesn't it, from both sides? And I think that's really important when we're thinking about conversations about whether a young person is ready for a fresh start in a mainstream school, because that has to be the intention in AP wherever you can, after a term, 2 terms at the latest. And that really is tier 2 of the AP reforms. Or they need more specialist intervention, which an AP setting may well be able to offer, and that would be tier 3 in the new system. Or they need to be back in a mainstream school. But going back again to the survey that I mentioned, interestingly, every single person that responded to the survey from the network said that they were finding it harder to get young people back into a mainstream setting when the setting felt they were ready for a fresh start. We're seeing that. We've had really good success of getting young people back into mainstream previously, and we're finding it really difficult now with some of our schools. They're literally saying, we'd love to help, we have in the past, we just can't. We haven't got the capacity, and therefore we're going to have to say no for now. And that's really hard for those young people, isn't it? Because they've come to us and we've been talking with them and their families from day one around the need to get back into a mainstream school where possible, to give them an even broader curriculum and support for next steps in their education. And they know they're ready because we've worked with them to get them to that point, and then they have to wait. I mean, that's a part of the challenge, as I said, at the moment. In terms of organisational structures, sharing staffing is crucial, isn't it? If you don't share staffing, I think it's very difficult to offer what needs to be offered. So the larger the organisation within AP, the easier it is to do that. There's no doubt about that. And of course, where that isn't the case, that can be tricky. I sometimes go into alternative provision settings and I struggle to understand the structure, if I'm honest, about why it's in place as it is. And sometimes when I talk to leaders, it might be because historically it's always been like that, and actually the structure hasn't flexed to accommodate the change in demand and the change in the way that AP needs to work these days. I mentioned partnerships a couple of times already. Partnerships with local authorities, schools, communities, charities, shared goals is the key. We have a partnership with an organisation called Impetus, who work in a space, if you like, between provisions, projects and funders, and a large organisation, the Henry Smith Foundation, wanted to put some additional funding in to support up to 5 provisions over a 5-year period to reduce exclusions. So and that's been a really useful project. We're just at the end of year 2 of that project at the moment. And that's what I mean about shared goals and trying to be creative about working with others. And the need to be really flexible. Obviously, you're all really flexible in the work that you do. You have to, because you're managing limited resources, aren't you? But I think there's a greater need to be flexible within AP at the moment than there probably ever was, and there was always quite a big need to be flexible. So I'm just going to pause there and just take any questions, any thoughts, open things up at this point. I'm conscious that you've been talked to a lot today, and just take stock for a couple of minutes. I think Stuart's got the mic if anybody needs it, but it's obviously quite a small room. Any thoughts? Do you mind just saying who you are and what organisation you work for as well? That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Extremely interesting. Anthony Prince from an Alternative Provision Academy, SAT, not MAT, in Hammersmith. Just as a matter of interest, on funding, you mentioned difficulties with local authorities. Can I, if it's not unfair, can I ask what range of top-up fees you feel one is able to charge from low to high? And that may vary from a standard top-up fee to extra top-up fees for SEN. Or if that's an unfair question, I do apologise.
It's fine. I'm going to talk really broadly, and I'm looking at Joe, who's our Director of Resources over here. So really it can vary, and the simple answer is it depends on the level of need of the young people. So of course to give I know you've asked for a range. If we just talk about what the range is currently, not just at Olive, I'm talking about generally across the sector, it can vary from 10k to 30. Yeah. The more special. So going back to that continuum, the more specialist, the higher it would be. So at Olive, we're in the middle of that really, I'd say in many respects. But what we do, and I'll mention it later, is we gag pool deliberately so that we can have a look at the resource and think about the needs of young people and think about how we'd work in terms of economies of scale. But it's a really good question. One thing that we can do that I guess a SAT might find it a little bit harder to do unless you have that benchmarking information, and it does exist, is to sort of say to one local authority, well, look, the average at Olive is the needs of young people that you're asking us to work is this, the needs in another local authority is this. Can we have a conversation about that? And I have lots of those conversations quite regularly. And they're pretty positive conversations, I have to say. So they're proactive, supportive conversations in partnership. So they're not combative conversations at all. I'm conscious that sort of partially answers your question. Is that enough for now?
Yes, it does. I just wanted to make sure we weren't an outlier anywhere.
Yeah.
I think we're comfortably towards probably the lower end of the range you mentioned, but of course special needs will need extra special needs.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Mark Burnett. I work 3 days a week for a diocese supporting school business managers. I'm a trustee over SAT, I'm a trustee over MAT, and I am an education advisor to schools in the independent and the public sector in my copious spare time. I'm interested because I'm working with a special school at the moment who are also struggling with negotiations. Do you work collaboratively with other alternative provision providers in the area in your negotiations, or do you do it on the own? Because one of the problems I have is that there seems to be an element of competition among special schools, where I think collaboration might be more productive.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, yeah, that local collaboration can be a challenge because obviously you can find that there are setting or mats that are thinking about, well, if I help you too much or work with you too much, is that going to create an issue for me? I don't see it that way. We don't at Olive, but that can be the case. So we tend to think much more about looking at that's why the national network is so helpful, because it breaks down some of those barriers. But I think it really depends on the values and the culture of the organisation. There are a number of CEOs that will share everything with everybody because they sort of see it as their moral imperative to do that, and there are others that might be a little bit more territorial, shall we say. Tanya. Anything, yeah, please.
I'm being really cheeky here and asking you a question. What I'm hearing, and I've heard all day actually, we were just talking about it before, was a real pressure on the system that you're all in, and you're all nodding, so that must be true then. I mean, what can we do to help you? Because you talk about collaboration, we can get together, we can talk to you. We were talking about how we can engage the Baroness more. What more do you need us to do? Because I've really got, look at hands straight up, I've really got an open mind here.
Great. Sorry. No, it's a great question. No, it's good to open it up.
I think there's 3 things we need to do for the sector. There needs to be more provision, full stop, across the country. I think there's not a local authority where there isn't the need for more, provision that's maintained, therefore less reliance on the private sector. I think we need to look at high needs funding, the top-up element that's a more broad approach across the country. You know, thinking of your rough 10 to 40, we're very complex needs special, and we don't have anywhere near that luxury. And we have children that are 4 to 1 on oxygen, life-limiting conditions, etc., arrive in ambulances. So there's a lot of, changes there. And I think the other thing is we need a better way of defending the tribunals that come through our doors every day. We've lost one today, which is right, absolutely right, that children's families should fight for what they believe is right for them. And I'm pleased that they feel that our setting is right. But we were built for 90. We now have 155 children on our roll as of today. We're going up to 204 in September. That's an extra one on top of that. And that is so difficult to manage. And I was speaking to Tanya earlier on, and the provision and the procurement, the way you can resource that is very chaotic. And I think they're the three things: more provision, uniformity of funding of the high needs block, and a way of defending or being more robust in tribunals would solve it for me.
Yeah, please, yeah. And then we have another, Stuart, yeah.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And everyone was nodding, so it sounds like there's some real common themes. I guess my next question is, how do you feel you are having that conversation with the people who are making the decisions? Because if you're all having that bilateral, I guess what I'm saying is, how can you get together and have a stronger voice? And I'm really happy to get involved in how we do that, because I can see the efficiency angle for this, I can hear the affordability angle, and I can also hear very loudly the care of the child angle as well. So they're all interrelated, of course. So if there's something we can do through school resource management to find a voice which perhaps wasn't there before, I'm really happy to see if we can do that. Yeah.
NOS is that vehicle which the DfE obviously helped to fund.
Yeah.
And I think for capacity and funding, yes, but I think when we're taking on or tackling the judicial process, then it's a much bigger thing than us in this room, and will require other departments within government to come together. But I think it's needed. I think we're at that point that I'm just seeing people, I'm not going to, but I see people leaving professional time. It's just hard work, and you're getting the wrong children placed. You're getting the children that can afford to go through a system, and they absolutely skew your profile, whether you're the high need, the low need, the middle need, whatever it is. And we're losing good people, which I think also makes recruitment a challenge as well, if you can't provide good cohorts of children. But not.
Stuart, I think Pauline had a comment, and then we have another one just on this side as well.
Hello, yes, thank you. So just picking up on a few things. So yes, I chair the National Network of Special Schools for School Business Professionals, which we set up on behalf of the DfE. So we've got really strong links in with the DfE. And just this week, we had a meeting with Benedict Coffin and Russell Ewens. So we are having those conversations with the department all the time. And I have to say, I really enjoy those conversations. They really do listen to it. I know they listen to us, and I know how hard their challenge is as well. As far as, talking about schools collaborating to get information and looking at top-up funding, I mean, that's something that we work on a lot in the network, and being able to provide information from each other to challenge decisions. We've definitely tried over the last 2 years to do benchmarking on top-up funding. I could show you a spreadsheet that would make your eyes water. It's very, very difficult because every local authority approaches things differently, and Mark's talked about that himself. I mean, I think it would be great to get that piece of work done, to look at what the bandings look like across every local authority, and just to have a look at them and see what that information tells us. But as far as finding out information from each other, I know that in the network, people have been able to challenge their local authorities because they've looked at what other people get and think this is not, we're similar and we're not getting that, and being able to use that evidence to pass on. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. I know there's one more question. I'm just going to make a couple of points and then do that at the end. Just hadn't realised, just obviously had the 5-minute warning as well. So I just want to make sure that we... a couple of points just to make, and it's an alternative provision point, really. And it is quite interesting because when we put out that survey, just to get a sense of how the sector was engaging with the tools, particularly, 56% said that they hadn't accessed them at all. And interestingly, 30% weren't even aware of them. So there's something there, and it speaks to that point about the connectivity, isn't it? And smaller settings working really hard and not necessarily having time because of lack of economies of scale to potentially be aware of that. But that's something that obviously, you know, Tanya, we can talk about a bit more, I'm sure, outside of this meeting. But so things will get a bit better when people are aware of it because the tools are great and are really helping. And you heard me ask a question this morning to David, whether around SRMAs and the sort of point of the question was there are still too many advisors going in who aren't necessarily aware of how complex it's become now and are making quite binary judgments sometimes based against a formula which is still quite mainstreamy. More are starting to get that, and we're starting to get some good feedback back as well. So it's not one way at all, far from it. But there are still some sort of high profile examples I'm picking up where that can be quite a challenge because of how the information is then being received. So there's a bit of work to be done, partly because it's just moving quite quickly and it's getting harder. So I think that's something in itself, without a doubt. Before we just take these 2 questions, and I want to make sure we get them. So my last point was, and it was a really important, big, positive point, which is about engagement. So engagement from the department and from the ESFA into the sector. Now, Pauline's nodding. I'm very aware, obviously, I'm fortunate enough to be engaged in much of this, and there's a real light being shone on. And the fact that we're here today talking about it, it's on the agenda, I think, speaks to that, doesn't it? So there's a real growing sense of that and a connectivity around the need to listen and the need to change things. And I'm really pleased about that. I have to say, it gives me a lot of hope for the future. We've got two quick questions just before we finish. Thank you.
It was actually coming back on the points made earlier about what else is... I work for a local authority, and we struggle with independent placements, which cost a lot. And it seems that we're always being asked for excessive fee increases. And we don't have any benchmarking, so we have to do it ourselves. And it's really hard to dig into the data around independence for all sorts of reasons. And that's if there was some, even if it was informal, sort of database of benchmarking information for the independent providers. I think as a sector of across the nation would be able to drive down prices of those placements, and ultimately if we're pushing down on those prices, it's going to help push into the much cheaper public sector.
Thank you. That's a really, really important point. And we have one final point before we move on. Just on the last point. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm one of those SRMAs, and one of the reasons I wanted to attend this was to help me better understand if I have a deployment for an AP. And I think it goes back to some of what Charles said. ICFP as a concept works, but we need to understand as an SRMA what are the best benchmarks, metrics and approach that we need to take, and what's not out there from my perspective. And if I can be pointed in the right direction, yes, please. How do I make an informed decision? Context is one thing, but where do I go to provide that comparator to be able to make it the supportive rather than judgmental deployment that it needs to be?
And I think that's where probably the next conversation needs to happen, doesn't it? Yeah.
I got it.
Brilliant. So just to finish off, thanks very much for your interest and engagement, and I'll be around for a couple of minutes if anybody wants a quick conversation. Thanks, everyone.